In the glittering landscape of Manhattan's Upper East Side, where wealth and influence flowed like champagne at endless social gatherings, Amira Hassan stood out, not for her designer clothes or her family's fortune, but for something far more precious, her genuine compassion for others. The young heiress, whose grace and kindness had become legendary among both the city's elite and its less fortunate, carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of her mother's lasting influence. On this particular autumn morning, as golden leaves danced along Fifth Avenue, Amira walked purposefully toward her favorite coffee shop, her mind already occupied with the day's charitable endeavors. At 25, she had transformed her substantial inheritance into a force for good, establishing programs that provided education and opportunities for underprivileged children throughout the city. Victoria Sterling, Amira's stepmother, watched her from the window of their penthouse apartment, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the crystal tumbler in her hand. The morning light caught the enormous diamond on her finger, a gift from her husband, Richard Hassan, who had married her 3 years after the passing of Amira's mother. "She's out there playing Mother Teresa again," Victoria muttered to herself, her voice thick with disdain. The sight of her stepdaughter's daily acts of charity had become a source of constant irritation. In Victoria's world, where social standing was everything, Amira's behavior threatened the carefully cultivated image she had built for the family. Richard, absorbed in his morning newspaper, merely grunted in response. He had long since learned to navigate between his daughter's philanthropic pursuits and his new wife's social ambitions. "Let her be, Victoria. She's doing good work." But Victoria wasn't listening. Her attention had fixed on a man sitting on the sidewalk outside their building, another of the city's countless homeless individuals whom Amira would undoubtedly stop to help. Something about this particular man caught Victoria's eye. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself despite his ragged appearance, or the intelligent gleam in his eyes as he observed the passing crowd. As predicted, Amira paused before him. From her vantage point, Victoria watched as her stepdaughter knelt down, heedless of her expensive dress, and engaged the man in conversation. The scene sparked something in Victoria's mind. A plan began to take shape, one that would finally put an end to what she saw as Amira's embarrassing behavior. "Richard, darling," Victoria called out, her voice suddenly honey-sweet. "I've been thinking about hosting another charity gala, something different this time." She turned from the window, a calculated smile playing across her features. "Something that will really make a statement." Meanwhile, on the street below, Amira was learning the story of James Miller, the man whose dignified bearing had caught her stepmother's attention. Unlike many others she had helped, James spoke with an education that belied his current circumstances. He described a past that seemed to have holes in it, gaps in his memory that he couldn't quite explain. "I know it sounds strange," he confided, accepting the coffee Amira had brought him, "but sometimes I feel like I'm looking at my life through a foggy window. There are pieces missing, important ones." Amira leaned forward, intrigued. "Have you seen a doctor about this?" "No insurance," James replied with a self-deprecating smile. "Besides, it's probably nothing, just the result of some hard times." As they talked, neither noticed Victoria's shrewd gaze from above, nor could they have guessed at the elaborate scheme she was already setting in motion. For Victoria, Sterling Hassan had recognized something in James Miller, something that could serve her purposes perfectly. Back in the penthouse, Victoria had moved to her private study, her fingers flying over her phone's keyboard as she made calls to her extensive network of connections. By day's end, she would have everything she needed to know about James Miller. Or at least, everything that remained to be known about a man who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere 18 months ago. What Victoria couldn't have anticipated was that her plan would unravel threads that had been carefully hidden for years. Threads that would lead back to her own past, to decisions made in darkness, and to a truth that threatened to shatter the sophisticated facade she had spent years constructing. Victoria Sterling Hassan's private study was a testament to her carefully curated life. Crystal vases held fresh orchids, and the walls displayed photographs of her standing alongside New York's most influential figures. But beneath the polished surface lay a woman consumed by an obsession to control every aspect of her world. As she sat at her mahogany desk, Victoria scrolled through the preliminary information her private investigator had sent about James Miller. The report was frustratingly thin. No records existed before 18 months ago, as if the man had materialized from thin air. This peculiarity, rather than deterring her, only strengthened her resolve. "Perfect," she whispered, her red lips curving into a smile. A blank canvas. She reached for an ornate jewelry box on her desk, opening it to reveal a collection of expensive pieces. Among them lay a vintage brooch, gold and sapphire, its design intricate and unusual. Victoria's fingers hesitated over it for a moment, a flicker of unease crossing her face, before she quickly closed the box. Meanwhile, Amira had spent the morning at her foundation's headquarters, reviewing proposals for new community programs. Her office, warm and inviting with its comfortable furniture and walls lined with children's artwork, reflected her approach to philanthropy, personal, direct, and heartfelt. "Miss Hassan," her assistant Sarah interrupted, "your stepmother is here to see you." Amira looked up, surprised. Victoria rarely visited the Foundation's offices, considering them beneath her social station. "Send her in, please." Victoria swept into the room, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Darling, I've had the most wonderful idea." She settled gracefully into a chair, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I've been thinking about your friend, the homeless man you were helping this morning." "James," Amira corrected gently. "His name is James Miller." "Yes, James," Victoria continued, waving her hand dismissively. "What would you say to giving him a complete transformation? New clothes, proper grooming, social instruction, everything he needs to rejoin society. We could document the entire process, make it the centerpiece of our next charity gala." Amira frowned slightly. "I don't know, Victoria. It seems rather exploitative, doesn't it? Using someone's misfortune as entertainment for the wealthy." "Oh, darling, you're looking at it all wrong." Victoria leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Think of the attention it would bring to your cause, the donations we could generate. One success story could inspire dozens more." As Victoria spoke, she could see the subtle shift in Amira's expression. Her stepdaughter's greatest weakness had always been her desire to help others, and Victoria knew exactly how to exploit it. Across town, James sat in a small diner, nursing a cup of coffee that Amira had given him money for. His fingers traced the edge of a napkin as his mind wandered to their conversation earlier. There was something about her kindness that stirred, something deep within him. Not romantic feelings, but a sense of familiarity that he couldn't quite place. He pulled out a small notebook from his worn jacket pocket. Inside, he had documented everything he could remember since waking up in a hospital 18 months ago. The doctors had called it retrograde amnesia, but there was something about the diagnosis that had never felt quite right. A waitress approached his table, her name tag reading Betty. She looked at him with kind eyes that reminded him of Amira's. "Would you like a refill, sir?" As she poured the coffee, her hand bumped against his cup, causing it to spill slightly. "Oh, I'm so sorry." She reached for a napkin to clean it up, but froze when she saw his face clearly. The coffee pot trembled in her hand. "Is everything all right?" James asked, concerned by her reaction. Betty quickly composed herself, but her voice shook slightly. Yes, of course. You just remind me of someone I used to know. Someone from a long time ago." Before James could press further, she hurried away, leaving him with an uneasy feeling. He looked down at his notebook, adding this strange interaction to his growing list of unexplained moments. Back at the foundation, Amira was finally relenting to Victoria's persistent persuasion. "All right," she agreed reluctantly, "but only if James is willing, and everything must be done with dignity and respect." Victoria's smile widened. "Of course, darling. I'll handle all the arrangements. Trust me, this will be a transformation that no one will forget." As she left Amira's office, Victoria pulled out her phone, quickly dialing a number. "It's done," she spoke quietly. "Start the preparations, and bring me everything you can find about a waitress named Betty at the Silver Spoon Diner. She may have just complicated things." What Victoria didn't realize was that her carefully laid plans were about to intersect with forces beyond her. Control. The very web she was weaving would soon become a trap of her own making, with consequences that would reach far beyond her initial scheme. The Silver Spoon Diner buzzed with its usual afternoon activity, but Betty Henderson couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled over her since her encounter with James. During her break, she sat in the small employee lounge, her hands trembling as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Martha, it's Betty. Yes, I know it's been a long time, but something's happened. I think I just saw Thomas Sterling." Across town, in a luxurious spa facility, Victoria supervised. As James underwent the first stage of his transformation, she had spared no expense. The best stylists, tailors, and etiquette coaches had been summoned to remake the man according to her exacting specifications. "The key," Victoria instructed the assembled team, "is to make him presentable without losing that authentic quality. We want a story of redemption, not a complete reinvention." James sat quietly in the salon chair, watching his reflection as layers of his former self were stripped away. The hot towels, expensive creams, and careful grooming felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain, as if his body remembered a time when such luxuries were commonplace. "Mrs. Sterling Hassan," one of the stylists called out. "We found this while cleaning his belongings." She held up a small notebook, its pages worn and filled with James's careful documentation of his fragmented memories. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers plucked the notebook from the stylist's hand. "I'll keep this safe for you, James. We wouldn't want it getting damaged during your treatments." Before he could protest, she had slipped it into her designer handbag, a calculating gleam in her eyes. Meanwhile, Amira sat in her office, reviewing the preliminary plans for the charity gala. The event was scheduled for 6 weeks away, giving them time to complete James's transformation. As she studied the documents, her assistant Sarah entered with an unusual expression. "Miss Hassan, there's someone here to see you, a woman named Betty Henderson. She says it's urgent and private." Amira looked up, surprised. "Did she say what it's about?" "No, but she seems quite agitated. She mentioned something about your stepmother and said you need to know the truth." In the spa's relaxation room, James closed his eyes as the soft music played around him. The familiar scents of essential oils triggered fleeting images in his mind. A grand house, a woman's laugh, the glint of a sapphire brooch. His eyes snapped open at the last image, his heart racing. "Is everything all right, sir?" A concerned attendant approached. "The brooch," James muttered, more to himself than the attendant. "I've seen it before, but where?" Victoria, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped forward smoothly. "Perhaps you saw it in a store window, James. The mind can play such tricks when we're trying to recover lost memories." Her voice was honey-sweet, but her eyes were sharp with warning. Back at Amira's office, Betty Henderson sat wringing her hands. Her diner uniform creased from her nervous fidgeting. "Miss Hassan, what I'm about to tell you, it might sound incredible, but you have to believe me. That man, your stepmother, is helping. I knew him before." Amira leaned forward, her full attention captured. "Before what, Mrs. Henderson?" "Before he disappeared. Before everything changed. His name wasn't James Miller then. It was Thomas Sterling. And he was married to your stepmother's sister." The revelation hung in the air like a thundercloud. Amira's mind raced, trying to process this information. "But Victoria never mentioned having a sister." "No." Betty's voice dropped to a whisper. "She wouldn't have. Not after what happened to the family fortune. Not after the accident that took Rebecca's life and left Thomas with no memory of who he was." Unknown to either woman, Victoria's private investigator sat in a car across the street, photographing Betty entering and leaving the foundation building. Within minutes, the images were on their way to Victoria's phone, along with a preliminary background check on Betty Henderson. In the spa's private consultation room, Victoria reviewed the messages on her phone, her composed facade cracking slightly. She looked through the glass partition at James, who was now being fitted for a bespoke suit. The man who had once been her brother-in-law stood straight and tall, his bearing naturally elegant, despite his recent circumstances. Victoria's hand moved to her bag, where James's notebook lay hidden. She knew she needed to read it before anyone else needed to know exactly how much he might be starting to remember. But more urgently, she needed to accelerate her plans. Betty Henderson's unexpected appearance had created a complication she hadn't anticipated. As the sun began to set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the city streets, the various players in Victoria's elaborate scheme moved like pieces on a chessboard. Each step brought them closer to a confrontation that would shatter the careful facades they had all constructed. The truth, like water finding its way through cracks in a dam, was beginning to seep through the barriers Victoria had spent years building. Inside her private study, Victoria pored over James's notebook, her perfectly composed facade cracking with each page she turned. The entries were fragmented, but revealing. Flashes of memories, recurring dreams, and most alarmingly, descriptions of a sapphire brooch that matched the one hidden in her jewelry box. "Memories are such fragile things," she murmured, closing the notebook with trembling hands. She reached for her phone, quickly dialing a familiar number. "Dr. Anderson, we need to adjust the medication schedule. He's starting to remember." Meanwhile, Amira sat in her car outside the public library, her mind still reeling from Betty Henderson's revelations. She had spent the afternoon searching through old newspaper archives, and what she found left her questioning everything she thought she knew about her stepmother. The Sterling family had once been as prominent as the Hassans, their wealth built on real estate and smart investments. But their fortune had vanished mysteriously, right around the time Rebecca Sterling had disappeared from public life. The official story spoke of a tragic accident, but the details were suspiciously vague. Inside the library's genealogy department, Sarah, Amira's loyal assistant, was piecing together the Sterling family tree. "Miss Hassan," she whispered into her phone, "you need to see this. I found Rebecca Sterling's will. Everything was left to her husband, Thomas, but he was never able to claim it because he vanished shortly after her accident." At the luxury spa, James stood before a full-length mirror, barely recognizing himself in the tailored suit. The transformation was more than physical. With each passing day, his bearing grew more naturally elegant, as if his body was remembering a life his mind had forgotten. "You clean up quite nicely," Victoria observed, entering the room with calculated casualness. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm wearing someone else's life," James replied, adjusting his tie with practiced ease that surprised even him. "Mrs. Sterling Hassan, may I have my notebook back? There are things I need to review." Victoria's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Oh, I'm afraid it was accidentally damaged during your spa treatment. The pages were completely ruined. But that's all in the past now, isn't it? We're focused on your future." Before James could respond, his attention was caught by a glint of light. Victoria was wearing the sapphire brooch he had been dreaming about. The sight of it sent a jolt through his system, fragments of memory flashing like lightning. A woman's gentle laugh, the scent of gardenias, a grand house overlooking the Hudson. "That brooch," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion he didn't understand. "Where did you get it?" Victoria's hand flew to the brooch, her fingers closing around it protectively. "This old thing? It's been in my family for years. Why do you ask?" "Because I've seen it before in my dreams, or maybe my memories. There was a woman wearing it. She was—" "James," Victoria interrupted sharply, "you're getting overwrought. Perhaps we should call Dr. Anderson. These episodes of confusion aren't helping your recovery." Across town, Amira was meeting with Martha Chen, Betty Henderson's contact and a retired nurse who had worked at the private hospital where Thomas Sterling had been treated. The small cafe they chose was quiet, perfect for sharing secrets. "You have to understand," Martha explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened at that hospital wasn't normal. The Sterling case was handled differently from the start. Special protocols, restricted access, unusual medications, and Victoria was always there, monitoring everything." "But why?" Amira pressed. "Why go to such lengths?" "Money," Martha replied, simply. "It's always about money." Thomas Sterling was set to inherit not just his wife's fortune, but also the remaining Sterling family assets. Assets that somehow ended up under Victoria's control after he disappeared. Back at the spa, James excused himself to the restroom, his head spinning with fragmented memories. As he splashed water on his face, he caught his reflection in the mirror. For a moment, another face seemed to overlay his own, younger, more refined, but undeniably his. In her car, Victoria clutched her steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. The careful plans she had laid were beginning to unravel. Betty Henderson's appearance had started a chain reaction she hadn't anticipated. She needed to accelerate her timeline, push forward with the gala before more of the past could surface. She pulled out her phone again, this time calling her event planner. "Move the gala up, 2 weeks from now, not 6. Yes, I know it's impossible. Make it possible. Everything needs to be perfect, understand? Perfect and fast." The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the dark secrets emerging from the past. In her office, Amira stared at the evidence she and Sarah had gathered. Newspaper clippings, legal documents, hospital records. The picture they painted was disturbing, but still incomplete. "Sarah," she called to her assistant, "get me everything. You can find about Dr. Anderson. If Victoria's still using him, he might be the key to understanding what really happened to Thomas Sterling." Dr. Marcus Anderson's office was a study in calculated precision. Every diploma hung at perfect angles, each chair positioned just so, creating an atmosphere of meticulous control. As he reviewed James's file, his carefully maintained composure showed the first signs of strain. "The dosage needs to be adjusted carefully," he explained to Victoria, who sat across from him with barely concealed impatience. "Too much, too quickly, could have adverse effects. We need to maintain the delicate balance we've achieved." Victoria's perfectly manicured nails tapped against the armrest of her chair. "We don't have time for delicate, Marcus. The gala is in 2 weeks, and I need him stable, whatever it takes." "Victoria." Dr. Anderson removed his glasses, cleaning them with deliberate slowness. "What you're asking, it goes beyond ethical considerations. The original treatment was questionable enough, but this..." "Ethics?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and cold. "You surrendered the right to discuss ethics years ago when you agreed to help me, or shall we revisit the details of that arrangement?" While this tense conversation unfolded, James was experiencing his own form of rebellion. Despite Victoria's constant supervision, he had managed to slip away from his handlers for a few precious hours. Something about the city streets called to him, pulling him toward places his conscious mind had forgotten, but his feet somehow remembered. He found himself standing before an elegant townhouse overlooking the Hudson River. The building was clearly abandoned, its once grand facade now showing signs of neglect, but something about it felt achingly familiar. As he stood there, memories flickered like old photographs. Garden parties on the lawn, music drifting through open windows, the scent of gardenias in the air. "It hasn't changed much, has it?" James turned to find Betty Henderson standing beside him, her diner uniform replaced by casual clothes. "You remember this place, don't you? Even if you don't know that you do." "I dream about it," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was a woman. She wore a sapphire brooch. We were happy here. That was Rebecca." Betty's voice was gentle. "Your wife, Victoria's sister." The word wife sent a jolt through James's system. Images flooded his mind. Rebecca's smile, her laugh, the way she would wear that brooch every Sunday for brunch. But along with these sweet memories came darker ones. Heated arguments with Victoria about the family business, missing documents, suspicious bank transfers. Meanwhile, Amira had made a breakthrough of her own. In a dusty corner of the city, records office, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Documentation of power of attorney transfers, all dated shortly after Thomas Sterling's disappearance. Victoria's signature was on every page. "Sarah," she spoke urgently into her phone, "I need you to contact Martha Chen again. Ask her about any unusual visitors Rebecca might have had at the hospital before her accident, and find out everything you can about Victoria's whereabouts during that time." At the Sterling townhouse, James and Betty continued their conversation, unaware they were being photographed from a parked car across the street. Victoria's private investigator transmitted the images in real time along with a message. Henderson made contact, situation compromised. Victoria received the message during her meeting with Dr. Anderson. Her composed facade cracked for just a moment, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. Change of plans, she announced, standing abruptly. We're moving the timeline up. Again, the gala happens this weekend. That's impossible, Dr. Anderson protested. The medications, the preparations, make it possible. Victoria's voice was steel. I don't care what it takes. Everything ends this weekend. Back at the townhouse, James was experiencing more frequent memory flashes. Each one felt like a piece of a puzzle falling into place, but the complete picture remained frustratingly out of reach. There was a study, he said suddenly, hidden compartment behind the bookshelf. Rebecca kept important papers there. Betty's eyes widened. Yes, the family documents, the real estate deeds, everything was stored there. But after the accident, when the police searched, the police never found it, James finished, the memory suddenly crystal clear. Because only Rebecca and I knew the mechanism to open it. Victoria never knew about it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the townhouse's neglected lawn, various forces were converging. Amira, armed with her discoveries from the city records office, was racing against time to prevent Victoria's plans. Dr. Anderson, trapped by his own past choices, wrestled with his conscience. And Victoria, sensing her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble, prepared to take desperate measures. Unknown to any of them, James was experiencing the strongest memory surge yet. Standing in front of his former home, watching the setting sun paint the Hudson River in shades of gold and crimson, the fragments of his past were finally starting to align into a coherent picture. And at the center of it all was that sapphire brooch, not just a piece of jewelry, but a key to unlocking the truth that Victoria had worked so hard to bury. The Hassan penthouse buzzed with frantic activity as event planners rushed to coordinate the hastily rescheduled gala. Victoria moved through the chaos like a general commanding her troops, issuing orders with precision while maintaining her perfectly composed exterior. But beneath her calm demeanor, a storm was brewing. The guest list needs to be perfect, she instructed her social secretary. Every influential name in Manhattan must be here to witness this. Her emphasis on the word witness carried a weight that made her assistant shiver involuntarily. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of Central Park, Amira sat with Sarah, spreading out the documents they'd gathered across a secluded bench. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of systematic deception spanning years. Look at these bank transfers, Sarah pointed to a series of transactions. Every major withdrawal from the Sterling accounts happened while Thomas was in the hospital, completely incapacitated. And every transfer required two signatures, Victoria's and Dr. Anderson's. Amira's fingers traced the paper trail. And here's where it gets interesting. The money didn't just disappear. It was converted into bearer bonds and high-end art pieces, things that could be easily moved and hidden. But why go through all this trouble, Sarah wondered. Why not just... Because she needed it to look legitimate, Amira finished. Victoria needed Thomas alive but unable to claim his inheritance. That's why she's kept him under Dr. Anderson's care all these years. A convenient medical excuse for why the rightful heir couldn't manage his own affairs. Across town, James stood in his newly furnished apartment, another piece of Victoria's elaborate transformation plan. But instead of focusing on his upcoming debut at the gala, he was lost in memories that grew stronger by the hour. The sapphire brooch haunted his thoughts. He could now clearly remember Rebecca wearing it at their wedding, the way it caught the light as they danced their first dance. But there was something else about the brooch, something vital that lingered just beyond his grasp. His phone buzzed. A message from Betty. Found something in the old employee records. Need to meet. Usual place, 1 hour. Before he could respond, there was a knock at his door. Dr. Anderson stood there, medical bag in hand. Time for your pre-gala checkup, James. We need to ensure you're stable for the big event. James felt a familiar fog trying to creep into his mind at the sight of the doctor, but this time he fought against it. Actually, doctor, I'm not feeling quite up to it today. Perhaps tomorrow? I must insist. Anderson's voice was firm, but His hands fidgeted with his bag. Victoria's orders are quite specific about your treatment schedule. In the Hassan penthouse, Victoria opened her wall safe, removing a small velvet box. Inside lay not just Rebecca's sapphire brooch, but a collection of papers, documents that could unravel everything if they ever came to light. Her fingers brushed against old photographs, Rebecca and Thomas on their wedding day, the entire Sterling family at their summer house, happier times before greed and ambition had poisoned everything. For a moment, Victoria's mask slipped, revealing a flicker of something that might have been regret. But then her phone buzzed with a message from her private investigator. Henderson found the employee records. Moving to intercept. Victoria's jaw tightened. "No," she typed back. "Let her meet with him. But make sure Dr. Anderson is there. It's time to end this game." At the foundation office, Amira was about to leave when her father, Richard, unexpectedly appeared. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "Your stepmother's behavior. It's been concerning me," he admitted, looking older and more tired than Amira had ever seen him. "This morning I found something in her study, something about Rebecca Sterling, and a hospital stay years ago. When I asked Victoria about it, He trailed off, his expression troubled. "Dad, there's something you need to know about Victoria," Amira began carefully, "about who she really is and what she's done." As storm clouds gathered over Manhattan, the players in Victoria's elaborate game moved toward their inevitable collision. In his apartment, James struggled against Dr. Anderson's insistence on administering his medication. At the diner, Betty Henderson clutched a manila envelope containing records that could change everything. And in her penthouse, Victoria prepared for a gala that she intended to be more than just a social triumph. It would be her masterpiece of manipulation. But even the most carefully laid plans can unravel, and the storm that was building would spare no one in its path. The truth, like water finding its way through cracks in a dam, was about to break free with devastating force. The Silver Spoon Diner had closed for the night, its neon sign dark against the gathering storm clouds. Inside, Betty Henderson spread the contents of her manila envelope across a worn formica table, while James looked on, his hands trembling slightly as he fought against the lingering effects of years of medication. "These are the original employee records from the Sterling estate," Betty explained, pointing to yellowed pages filled with neat handwriting. "I was more than just a waitress back then. I was the house manager. I kept copies of everything." James picked up a photograph that had fallen from the envelope. It showed a grand Christmas party, the Sterling mansion decorated with elegant garlands and twinkling lights. In the center of the image stood a younger version of himself, arms wrapped lovingly around a beautiful woman wearing the sapphire brooch. "Rebecca," he whispered, the name feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on his tongue. She loved Christmas, always insisted on decorating the whole house herself. "Yes," Betty smiled sadly. "But look at this one." She slid another photograph across the table. It showed Victoria standing slightly apart from the happy couple, her expression a mixture of envy and calculation. She was different back then, before the ambition consumed her. Meanwhile, in Richard Hassan's private study, Amira watched as her father sank heavily into his leather chair, the weight of her revelations evident in his posture. The documents she had brought him, bank statements, medical records, power of attorney papers, told a story of betrayal that spanned years. "I can't believe I was so blind," Richard muttered, running a hand over his face. "All these years, Victoria has been, and that poor man James is actually Thomas Sterling." "Dad, there's more." Amira leaned forward, her voice gentle but urgent. "The gala this weekend, it's not just a social event. Victoria's planning something that could hurt a lot of people." At that moment, in her luxurious penthouse bathroom, Victoria stood before the mirror, applying her makeup with mechanical precision. The sapphire brooch gleamed at her throat, its blue depths seeming to hold secrets of their own. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Anderson. "He's refusing treatment. Henderson has the records." Victoria's hand stilled, her lipstick hovering just above her mouth. For a moment, her reflection showed something close to fear before her features hardened into resolve. She typed back a single word: proceed. Back at the diner, Betty was showing James a series of ledgers. Rebecca kept meticulous records of everything: the family investments, property deeds, trust funds. She never trusted computers, always. Insisted on keeping paper copies. James's fingers traced the elegant handwriting, triggering more memories. The study, he said suddenly. Behind the bookshelf, there was a hidden compartment. Rebecca stored the most important documents. There? Yes? Betty's eyes lit up. The combination was... The diner's door chimed, cutting her off. Dr. Anderson stood in the entrance, flanked by two men in dark suits. James, he said smoothly, you missed your medication schedule. We can't have you getting unstable. Before the gala, James stood, positioning himself between Betty and the newcomers. No more medications, doctor, no more lies. I'm starting to remember everything. That's exactly what concerns us, Anderson replied, nodding to his companions, who began moving forward. Victoria was quite clear about the importance of keeping you comfortable. In the Hassan penthouse, Victoria made a final call. Is everything prepared for the gala? She asked, her voice tight with controlled tension. Yes, Mrs. Sterling Hassan, her event planner replied, though I must say some of your requests are rather unusual. Just follow my instructions precisely, Victoria snapped. Everything must be perfect. The entire city will be watching. What Victoria didn't know was that across town, Sarah had made a breakthrough. In a dusty corner of the city records office, she had discovered something that changed everything: a second will, filed secretly by Rebecca Sterling just days before her accident. As rain began to fall over Manhattan, the various players in this complex drama moved like pieces on a chessboard. In the diner, James and Betty faced off against Dr. Anderson and his men. In his study, Richard Hassan grappled with the truth about his wife. And in her penthouse, Victoria prepared for what she believed would be her greatest triumph, unaware that the carefully constructed walls of her deception were about to come crashing down. The sapphire brooch at her throat caught the light of another lightning flash, its blue depths holding one final secret, one that would change everything when revealed. For within its elegant setting lay not just a precious stone, but a key to unlocking the truth that Victoria had worked so hard to bury. Lightning illuminated the interior of the Silver Spoon Diner in stark flashes as the standoff continued. James stood his ground, his posture becoming more confident with each passing moment, as memories of his true identity solidified in his mind. Think carefully about your next move, Dr. Anderson, he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise even him. I may not remember everything yet, but I remember enough to know that what you and Victoria did was wrong. Betty Henderson had quietly slipped the old photographs and documents back into their envelope, her experienced eyes darting between the men blocking the door and the diner's back exit. Years of managing the Sterling household had taught her to always have a contingency plan. James, Dr. Anderson's voice was carefully modulated, professional. You're experiencing a severe dissociative episode. These delusions about being Thomas Sterling? They're not delusions, James cut him off. The brooch Victoria wears, it belonged to Rebecca. It was a family heirloom passed down through generations of Sterling women. But it's more than just jewelry, isn't it, Doctor? That's why Victoria never lets it out of her sight. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Anderson's face, visible in another flash of lightning. Mrs. Sterling Hassan's personal accessories are hardly relevant to your medical condition. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah burst into Richard Hassan's study, where he and Amira were still reviewing Victoria's paper trail of deception. Miss Hassan! Mr. Hassan! I found it! She spread out a legal document on the desk, her hands shaking with excitement. Rebecca Sterling's second will, filed secretly just days before her accident, and you won't believe what it says about the brooch. At the Hassan penthouse, Victoria stood in her walk-in closet, surveying the designer gown she'd chosen for the gala. The sapphire brooch was already pinned in place, its deep blue stones catching the light. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her private investigator. Situation at diner escalating. Hassan girl has found second will. Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked. Her fingers flew to the brooch, twisting it in a specific pattern. There was a tiny click as a hidden compartment in the jewelry opened, revealing a small key and a micro SD card. All these years, she whispered to her reflection, all the planning, the manipulations. It comes down to this weekend. She closed the compartment with another click, her expression hardening with resolve. Back at the diner, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Dr. Anderson's men had taken a step forward, but James held his ground. I remember the combination to the study's hidden compartment, Doctor, and I remember what Rebecca kept there, documents that would expose everything you and Victoria did. James, please. Anderson's professional demeanor was slipping. Think about what you're doing. Victoria has worked so hard to give you a fresh start, a new life. A life built on lies, Betty interjected, her voice sharp with years of suppressed anger. I watched it all happen. Watched Victoria slowly take control of everything. Watched her manipulate Rebecca's accident to her advantage. Watched her turn Thomas Sterling into James Miller, a convenient puppet she could control. In his study, Richard Hassan read through the second will with growing horror. This can't be right, he muttered, looking up at a mirror. According to this, the brooch contains evidence of massive financial fraud. Rebecca knew Victoria was embezzling. From the family foundation knew she was falsifying documents. She hid the proof inside the brooch itself. That's why Victoria never takes it off, Amira realized. It's not about sentiment, it's about protecting herself. But there's something else here. She pointed to a paragraph near the end of the will. Rebecca left instructions about a second key, hidden somewhere in the old Sterling mansion, a key that, when combined with the one in the brooch, a crash of thunder shook the windows of the Silver Spoon diner. In that moment, James had a final crucial memory. Rebecca showing him a hidden safe in their bedroom, explaining the importance of the two keys, making him memorize a sequence of numbers. The brooch, he said suddenly, his voice clear and strong. It's not just about the evidence inside it. It's about what it can unlock when combined with the second key. Dr. Anderson's calm facade finally cracked. Enough! He gestured to his men. Get him out of here. Now, use whatever force necessary. But as the men moved forward, the diner's back door burst open. Amira stood there, Richard Hassan right behind her, holding the second will like a weapon. Step away from them, Doctor. Anderson, Amira commanded. It's over. We know everything. Thunder rolled across the Manhattan sky as all the players in Victoria's elaborate game faced each other in the fluorescent-lit diner. The truth, so long buried under layers of deception, was finally rising to the surface. And in her penthouse, unaware of the drama unfolding across town, Victoria continued preparing for a gala that she believed would be her crowning achievement, but which was rapidly becoming the stage for her greatest downfall. The Hassan penthouse hummed with activity as an army of caterers and decorators transformed the space for the upcoming gala. Victoria stood in the center of it all, like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony. But beneath her cool exterior, anxiety gnawed at her composure. Her phone had gone silent with no updates from Dr. Anderson or her private investigator. Mrs. Sterling Hassan, her event planner approached cautiously. The guest list has grown considerably. The society columnist from the Times is particularly interested in the transformation story. Victoria's smile was sharp as glass. Perfect. I want every influential person in Manhattan to witness this evening. It needs to be unforgettable. She touched the sapphire brooch at her throat, drawing comfort from its familiar weight and the secrets it contained. Meanwhile, the scene at the Silver Spoon diner had transformed into an unexpected confrontation. Dr. Anderson's men hesitated, caught between their orders and the arrival of Richard Hassan, one of the city's most powerful figures. I said, "Step away," Amira repeated, her voice steady. She held up the second will. "We know about the brooch, Doctor. We know about the keys, the hidden safe, everything." James, or rather Thomas Sterling, moved to stand beside her, his bearing now completely transformed. Gone was the uncertain homeless man. In his place stood the rightful heir to the sterling fortune, his memories and identity growing stronger by the minute. "The medication you've been giving me," he said, fixing Anderson with a steel gaze. "It wasn't just to keep me confused, was it? It was specifically designed to suppress certain memories. Memories about the brooch, about Rebecca's discoveries." Anderson's professional facade crumbled entirely. "You don't understand," he pleaded, looking between Richard and Amira. "Victoria, she has evidence that could destroy my career, my life. She didn't give me a choice." "There's always a choice." Richard's voice was heavy with disappointment. "Just as I have a choice now." He pulled out his phone, beginning to dial. But Anderson lunged forward desperately. "No, you can't, she'll—" But before he could finish, Betty Henderson stepped forward, her years of quiet observation finally finding voice. "She'll what, Doctor? Reveal how you helped her manipulate Thomas's condition, how you falsified medical records to help her gain control of the sterling fortune, or perhaps how you looked the other way when Rebecca tried to warn you something." "Was wrong." The rain intensified outside, drumming against the diner's windows. Thomas touched his temple, another memory surfacing. "The night of the accident," he said slowly, "Rebecca had called you, hadn't she? She'd discovered something in Victoria's private accounts." "Stop!" Anderson shouted, but the truth was already unspooling. "She called you because she trusted you," Betty continued, her voice thick with emotion. "She thought, as the family doctor, you would help protect her. Instead, you called Victoria." At the penthouse, Victoria's phone finally chimed. The message from her private investigator was brief but devastating. "Hassan has second will. Sterling remembering everything. Anderson compromised." For a moment, Victoria's carefully constructed mask slipped completely, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. She turned to her event planner. "Move the gala up. Start it now. Call everyone. Tell them to come immediately. It's a spontaneous celebration." "But Mrs. Sterling, Hassan, it's barely afternoon. The preparations aren't—" "I don't care. Make it happen now." Back at the diner, Anderson's men had backed away, their loyalty to Victoria evaporating in the face of Richard Hassan's authority and the damning evidence before them. But Anderson himself remained, a broken man caught in the web of his own choices. "The safe in the Sterling mansion," Thomas pressed, his memories now flowing freely. "What's inside it? What was so important that Victoria needed both keys to keep it locked away?" "The original documents," Anderson whispered, defeated. "Records of every transaction, every manipulation. Rebecca had been gathering evidence for months. She hid copies in the brooch, but the originals. Victoria couldn't destroy them because she needed them to maintain control of the accounts. So she locked them away, using both keys to ensure no one could access them without her." Amira's phone buzzed, a society news alert that made her blood run cold. "She's moving up the gala," she announced. "Victoria's telling people to come. Out of the penthouse now. She's going to try to complete whatever she has planned before we can stop her." Thunder cracked overhead as the group looked at each other, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. They had the truth, they had evidence, but Victoria still held one of the keys they needed, and she had just accelerated her timetable. "We need to get to that gala," Thomas said, standing tall. "But first, we need to make a stop at the Sterling mansion. It's time to reclaim what's mine." The storm raged over Manhattan as they moved into action, each person knowing their role in what was to come. Victoria's carefully constructed facade was cracking, but a cornered predator is often at its most dangerous. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake Manhattan society to its core, and at the center of it all, a sapphire brooch continued to guard its final devastating secrets. The old Sterling mansion loomed before them, its weathered facade a shadow of its former grandeur. Thomas Sterling stood at the gates, memories washing over him like the rain that continued to fall. Behind him, Amira, Richard, and Betty waited in tense silence while Sarah kept watch from their car. "The study's hidden compartment," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Rebecca designed it herself. She always was brilliant with puzzles and mechanics." They made their way through the abandoned house, their footsteps echoing on marble floors that had once gleamed with polish. The study, when they reached it, remained largely untouched, as if time had frozen in this one room, preserving the last traces of Rebecca Sterling's presence. There, Thomas pointed to the massive bookshelf that covered the far wall. Behind the complete works of Shakespeare, Rebecca loved the symbolism, all the world's a stage and all that. Meanwhile, at the Hassan penthouse, Victoria's hastily accelerated gala was taking shape. The city's elite had responded to her urgent summons, intrigued by the promise of an unprecedented social event. They arrived in evening wear, buzzing with speculation about the mysterious urgency of the invitation. Victoria stood greeting her guests, the sapphire brooch gleaming at her throat. Each smile, each air kiss, each gracious welcome masked her growing desperation. Her phone remained clutched in her hand, still showing the last message from her investigator. "They're at the Sterling mansion." "Victoria, darling," one of her oldest society friends approached. "Everyone's simply dying to meet this mysterious man you've been rehabilitating. When will he be making his appearance?" Victoria's smile never faltered. "All in good time, dear. Tonight is full of surprises." Back at the mansion, Thomas had located the hidden mechanism. His fingers, remembering a pattern they had performed countless times before, moved across the shelf's ornate carvings. There was a soft click, and a section of the bookshelf swung silently outward. "The safe," he breathed, running his hands over the smooth metal surface. "It needs both keys, the one from the brooch and this one." Betty stepped forward, pulling a small key from a chain around her neck. "Rebecca gave it to me for safekeeping the day before everything changed. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment." Amira's phone buzzed again, another update from the gala. "Victoria's gathered everyone," she reported. "She's planning some kind of announcement. We need to hurry." In the penthouse, the party was in full swing. Victoria had arranged for reporters from every major society column to be present, their cameras ready to document what she had promised would be an unforgettable evening. The sapphire brooch caught the light as she moved through the crowd, each flash of blue a reminder of what she stood to lose. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, tapping her glass for attention, "I've gathered you all here tonight for something extraordinary, a story of transformation, of redemption." Her words were cut short by a commotion at the entrance. The crowd parted, and there stood Thomas Sterling, not James Miller, not the homeless man she had sought to manipulate, but Thomas Sterling in his full dignity. Beside him stood Amira, Richard, and Betty Henderson, their faces set with determination. Victoria's composure cracked for just a moment before she rallied. "Ah, James, darling, everyone, this is the man I've been telling you about. Such an inspiring story of my name," his voice carried across the suddenly silent room, "is Thomas Sterling, and that brooch you're wearing belongs to my wife." The assembled guests began to murmur, phones appearing to capture the drama unfolding before them. Victoria's hand flew to the brooch, her fingers closing around it protectively. But as she looked around the room, she saw not the audience she had hoped to manipulate, but witnesses to her unraveling. "Thomas," she said, her voice honey-sweet, but trembling slightly, "you're confused. The medication is no longer controlling him." Amira stepped forward. "We know everything, Victoria. About the brooch, about Rebecca's accident, about how you and Dr. Anderson conspired to keep Thomas hidden away while you stole his inheritance." The storm outside had reached its peak, lightning illuminating the penthouse in stark flashes. Victoria stood at the center of her carefully orchestrated gala, watching as her world began to crumble. But she had one final card to play, one last desperate gambit that could still turn everything in her favor. Her fingers moved to the brooch, twisting it in a familiar pattern. The tiny compartment opened, and she pulled out the key and micro SD card. "You want the truth?" Her voice rang out, all pretense of sweetness gone. "Let me show you exactly what truth looks like." The assembled guests watched in stunned silence as Manhattan's most explosive society drama began its final act. The storm raged outside, but inside the Hassan penthouse a different kind of tempest was about to break loose, one that would change the lives of everyone present forever. The Hassan penthouse had become a theater of tension, with Manhattan's elite forming an impromptu audience to the drama unfolding before them. Victoria stood at the center of it all, the sapphire brooch now open in her hands, its hidden contents exposed. "You want to know the truth?" Victoria's voice carried across the silent room. "Let me tell you about truth. Let me tell you about loyalty and family." She held up the micro SD card, her hand steady despite the tremor in her voice. Rebecca wasn't the saint everyone believed her to be. These files tell a very different story. Thomas stepped forward, his restored memories giving him a confidence that commanded attention. "No more lies, Victoria. We've already been to the mansion. We've opened the safe." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Victoria's face, but she pressed on. "The safe? Impossible. You'd need both keys, and I have—" "This one?" Betty Henderson stepped forward, holding up the second key. "The one Rebecca gave me for safekeeping? The one she trusted me with because she knew what you were planning?" The assembled guests murmured, phones recording every moment of the confrontation. Victoria's carefully crafted social facade began to crack, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "I did what I had to do. The sterling fortune was being wasted on charity cases and lost causes. Rebecca was giving everything away, piece by piece. Someone had to take control. So you orchestrated her accident." Thomas's voice was quiet but carried the weight of remembered pain. "You arranged for my treatment with Dr. Anderson. Also, you could control the family fortune." "Control?" Victoria laughed, a brittle sound. "I saved it. I turned it into an empire. Everything I did for the family name." Amira moved to stand beside Thomas. "We found Rebecca's second will, Victoria. We know about the evidence she collected. The proof of your embezzlement, the falsified documents, everything she hid in that safe. Evidence that you couldn't destroy," Richard added, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Because you needed those original documents to maintain your control over the accounts. So you locked them away using both keys as insurance." Victoria's eyes darted around the room, seeing her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The society reporters she had invited to witness her triumph were now documenting her downfall. The elite guests who had been her puppets were now her judges. "You don't understand," she tried again, her voice taking on a pleading edge. "I had plans for everything. The gala, James's transformation. It was going to be perfect. A story of redemption, of second chances. A story built on lies," Thomas countered. "But Rebecca left us the truth, didn't she? Hidden in that safe, waiting all these years. The original documents, the real accounts, her personal journals. Everything needed to expose what you did." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating Victoria's face as realization dawned. She had orchestrated her own downfall. In her desperate rush to maintain control, she had gathered the perfect audience to witness her exposure. "The truth," she whispered, her fingers closing around the brooch, "is whatever we choose to believe." With a sudden movement, she turned toward the balcony doors, but Richard stepped forward, his authority filling the room. "Enough, Victoria," he commanded. "It's over." The storm outside began to ease, as if nature itself was acknowledging the turning of the tide. The gathered guests watched in stunned silence as Victoria Sterling Hassan, the Queen of Manhattan society, finally faced the consequences of her actions. Sarah, who had been quietly moving through the crowd, approached Amira with a tablet displaying breaking news headlines. The story was already spreading through the city's social circles, but not in the way Victoria had planned. Instead of a triumphant tale of philanthropy and redemption, it had become a story of justice long delayed, but finally served. Thomas looked at the brooch in Victoria's hands, the small piece of jewelry that had played such a crucial role in preserving the truth. Rebecca always said that beauty could hide profound purpose, he mused. She designed that brooch not just as a family heirloom, but as a key to unlocking the truth when the time was right. The assembled guests began to move away, forming small groups to discuss the shocking revelations they had witnessed. But the core players in this drama remained locked in their final confrontation, each understanding that the next few moments would determine how this story would end. As the storm outside began to subside, the atmosphere in the Hassan penthouse underwent its own transformation. The shocked whispers of Manhattan's elite created a subtle backdrop to the more intimate drama playing out in the center of the room. Victoria stood frozen, the sapphire brooch still clutched in her trembling hands. The confident socialite who had orchestrated countless galas and manipulated so many lives had vanished, replaced by a woman forced to face the consequences of her actions. "I want to understand," Richard said, breaking the tense silence. "All these years, Victoria, was any of it real?" Victoria's shoulders sagged, the weight of her deceptions finally becoming too heavy to bear. "The ambition was real," she whispered. "The desire to be more than just the other Sterling sister. When I saw how Rebecca and Thomas managed their fortune, giving so much away to charity," she shook her head. "I couldn't watch the family legacy be dismantled piece by piece." "Legacy?" Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. Rebecca understood what true legacy means. It's not about hoarding wealth or maintaining social status. It's about the impact we have on others' lives. Amira stepped forward, her natural compassion showing even in this moment of confrontation. "The foundation Rebecca started, it's still doing amazing work. The lives changed, the opportunities created. That's the real Sterling legacy." The remaining party guests had formed a loose circle around them, witness to this final act of a drama that had spanned years. Society columnists typed furiously on their phones, but even they seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, maintaining a respectful distance. "The brooch," Betty Henderson spoke up, her voice carrying decades of loyal service. "Rebecca always said it was more than just jewelry. She said it was a reminder that beauty should serve a greater purpose." Victoria looked down at the sapphire brooch in her hands, seeing it truly for the first time. Not as a tool of control or a hiding place for secrets, but as her sister's final gift to the world, a key to unlocking the truth when the time was right. With hands that had finally stopped trembling, she held out the brooch to Thomas. "She would have wanted you to have this back," she said quietly, "along with everything else I took from you." Thomas accepted the brooch, its familiar weight bringing back a flood of memories, happy ones this time, of Rebecca wearing it at charity events, of her explaining its hidden mechanism, of her unwavering belief in using their fortune to help others. "What happens now?" one of the society reporters called out, breaking the intimate moment. Richard stepped forward, his authority natural and unforced. "Now we honor Rebecca's true legacy. The Sterling Foundation will be restored to its original mission, with Thomas and Amira working together to continue its charitable works." "And the evidence," another reporter pressed. "The documents from the safe?" "Will be handled appropriately," Richard assured them, his tone brooking no further questions. "The focus now is on healing and restoration, not retribution." Victoria straightened, a glimmer of her old dignity returning. "I'll resign from all boards and social committees immediately," she announced, "and I'll cooperate fully in restoring the Foundation's assets." The crowd began to disperse, understanding that the real drama, the human story beneath the scandal, was drawing to a close. As the last guests departed, Thomas found himself standing by the penthouse windows, watching the storm clouds break apart to reveal patches of stars. Amira joined him, her presence offering quiet support. "What will you do first?" she asked, "now that you have everything back?" Thomas smiled, holding up the sapphire brooch. "Rebecca always believed that wealth was a tool for positive change. I think it's time to honor that belief. The foundation needs modernizing, expanding. There's so much more we could be doing." "We?" Amira raised an eyebrow. "If you're willing," Thomas nodded. "Your work with your own foundation shows you understand what Rebecca was trying to achieve. Together, we could create something extraordinary." From across the room, Betty Henderson watched this exchange with tears in her eyes. After years of keeping Rebecca's secrets, of waiting for the right moment, she could finally see her old friend's vision coming full circle. The night that had begun with Victoria's attempted triumph was ending with something far more meaningful, the resurrection of Rebecca Sterling's dream, carried forward by those who truly understood its value. 6 months after the dramatic events at the Hassan penthouse, the newly renovated Sterling Foundation headquarters buzzed with purposeful energy. The building, once a symbol of Victorian excess, had been transformed into a modern center of philanthropy and community outreach. Thomas Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the sapphire brooch displayed in a small glass case on his desk. The morning sun caught its facets, sending blue reflections dancing across the walls, a daily reminder of Rebecca's vision and the power of truth to prevail. "The new youth education program launches next week," Amira announced, entering with a stack of papers. "We've already received twice the applications we expected." Thomas smiled, turning from the window. The past months had seen him and Amira working tirelessly to rebuild and expand the Foundation's work. Their partnership had brought fresh energy to Rebecca's original mission, combining his restored memories of the Foundation's history with Amira's innovative approaches to charitable giving. "Betty called," Amira continued, settling into one of the comfortable chairs they'd installed to make grant applicants feel welcome. "The community center renovation is ahead of schedule. She's really found her calling as our project manager. She always did have a gift for organizing," Thomas replied warmly, "and for keeping important things safe until the right moment." The door opened again, admitting Sarah with their morning schedule. "The Times reporter is here for the interview about the Foundation's expansion," she reported. And Richard sent over the final paperwork for Victoria's arrangement. In the months following the gala, Victoria had maintained her word about making amends. While she'd stepped away from Manhattan society, she'd worked quietly with financial investigators to restore misappropriated funds and correct years of creative accounting. Her expertise, ironically, proved invaluable in untangling the complex web she'd created. "How is she?" Thomas asked softly, surprising himself with the genuine concern in his voice. "Better," Amira replied. "Dad says the therapy is helping. She's starting to understand why she did what she did. Last week, she even asked if she could make an anonymous donation to the Foundation's new mental health initiative." The significance of this gesture wasn't lost on either of them. Victoria's journey toward redemption was gradual but genuine, a different kind of transformation than the one she'd planned for that fateful gala. Dr. Anderson, too, had found his own path to redemption. After fully cooperating with the investigation, he dedicated himself to helping other victims of medical manipulation, becoming an advocate for ethical psychiatric care. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the Times reporter, a young woman whose eyes widened at the sight of the sapphire brooch in its case. "Mr. Sterling," she began, "your story has captivated the city. A lost heir restored, a decades-long deception exposed, a charitable foundation reborn. But what our readers really want to know is, what comes next?" Thomas exchanged a glance with Amira before responding. "What comes next is what Rebecca always envisioned, using privilege and resources to create real, lasting change in people's lives. The Foundation isn't just about giving money, it's about giving opportunity, dignity, and hope." "And the brooch?" the reporter asked, gesturing to the display case. "There are rumors about its significance." "The brooch," Thomas smiled, "represents something Rebecca understood deeply, that beautiful things should serve a greater purpose. It protected the truth until the right moment, just as she planned. Now it stands as a reminder that our real legacy isn't in what we keep, but in what we give." As the interview continued, life pulsed through the Foundation's halls. Grant writers collaborated on new proposals, community organizers planned upcoming events, and a steady stream of people came seeking help and offering solutions. In a quiet corner of the building, a new plaque hung beside a restored portrait of Rebecca Sterling. The inscription read, "Truth, like light, cannot be hidden forever. It finds its way through the smallest openings to illuminate the darkness." The sapphire brooch caught another ray of sunlight, sending blue sparkles across the room like stars. Its days of hiding secrets were over, but its power to inspire remained undiminished. In its gleaming depths, one could see reflected the truth Rebecca had always known, that the greatest wealth lies not in what we possess, but in the lives we touch and the changes we inspire. And so, the Sterling legacy continued, transformed, but unbroken, a beacon of hope in a city that had witnessed its fall and rise. The story of betrayal and redemption, of lost identity and restored purpose, had become part of Manhattan's legendary tales. But more importantly, it had become a testament to the enduring power of truth, compassion, and the courage to begin again. Fimda Historia. Dear listeners, We hope the tale of Thomas Sterling and the sapphire brooch has touched your hearts. This story of truth, redemption, and the power of genuine compassion reminds us that real transformation comes not from outward appearances, but from the choices we make and the lives we touch. If this journey through Manhattan's glittering world of secrets and revelations has moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what moments touched you most deeply. For more captivating stories that explore the complexity of human nature and the triumph of truth, click the link to your left. Join us tomorrow for another unforgettable tale of transformation and redemption. Until then, remember that like the sapphire brooch, each of us has the power to protect and reveal truth in our own unique way.